made class go like 45 minutes longer than normal, or always a lot longer than scheduled. So, if any of you were flagging at the end of the last class, for which I certainly couldn't blame you, I wanted to sort of review a little bit and just sort of review the concepts, the things, the ideas that were sort of floating around that we were observing, sort of as we continue to sort of put them together and see not just the pattern that they make, but the way that that pattern changes over time, and sort of help us to move towards the end here. Okay. Now, remember that the sort of the focal point of the 3 chapters we did last time was Ender being trapped at the end of the world, right? We started with the giant's drink, and then we were looking at the room at the end of the world. Those 2 scenes from the fantasy game were really, I think, really sort of the center of that whole portion of the story. There's a sense in which I think, you can sort of say, on the one hand, obviously, the action of, Ender in his launch group and in his with the armies, with Salamander and Rat Army there at the beginning last time, you could say, that's obviously the real action, and the fantasy game sequences are, some people might perhaps view them as sort of digressions. I certainly don't think they are, but anyway, they certainly are sort of, they're extras, right? They're the sidelights. But the more we were talking about it, the more I was thinking that through last time, the less that seemed to be the case. That to me, it seemed like in those 3 chapters we looked at last time, the fantasy game scenes were where the real action was, and the rest of the story, not only things like Colonel Graff's visit to Valentine, but all of Ender's activity with Salamander Army and Rat Army were themselves like the sideline, were themselves almost like a kind of commentary upon, they sort of provided us with the clues that we needed to begin to try to understand and piece together what was really important, which is what's going on in the fantasy game. So anyways, we had Ender trapped in that room at the end of the world, and you remember the primary elements of that. We have the rug, which unwound itself into a snake, which the first time he goes there addresses Ender and says that his name is Death, the snake, that he's the only escape. And Ender, of course, his standard procedure was to stomp on the head of the snake before it could attack him, grind the head of the snake until the snake was dead, but then he was stuck, and there was that mirror there in which Peter's face, remember, not Peter's face as Ender remembered him, but Peter's face as it was on Earth at that time, changed and different with a new haircut that Ender wouldn't have known, that Ender wouldn't have recognized. So it's Peter, contemporary Peter, that he sees in the mirror, and Peter's image in the mirror has the tail of a snake hanging out of his mouth, blood dripping down his chin. And Ender can't do anything. Everything he tries to do, he throws the dead snake, he tries to pry the mirror off the wall, results in his horrid death, kind of like the horrid and gruesome deaths of his mouse character when he was putting his head into the cups, the bucket-sized cups offered to him by the giant earlier on. So, of course, we were thinking about and talking about a little bit the obvious connection with Peter. Him seeing Peter in the mirror seems to have, there are some cues which seem kind of obvious, right? I mean, that is, there seems, on the one hand, to be a pretty readily obvious interpretation to put on that. And I say that in particular because it seems to be the interpretation that the people in the story put on it, right? We have Ender, of course, who's encountering the game, but of course we also have Colonel Graff, who's watching Ender in the game very carefully. So he's seeing all of these things too. And the fact that it's Peter in the mirror, some people were asking last time, some comments that I didn't get to, does Peter being in the mirror, would that actually imply that Ender is the opposite of Peter? You get the whole mirror reverse thing, and I don't think so. At least, perhaps that could be a kind of a subtext, but it does not. That certainly doesn't seem to me as like the obvious link, right? I mean, when you look in the mirror, what do you expect to see? yourself, right? You can see your own image. So if in place of his own image he sees Peter, what that would seem to imply is an identity between himself and Peter, right? He looks in the mirror, and what does he see? He sees Peter. And not only does he see Peter, but he sees Peter in sort of monstrous pose, right? You have the cruelty and this sort of brooding evil of Peter, apparently represented by the fact that he has eaten the snake. It's like the most inhuman way to approach the snake issue. Ender comes up and stomps his heel on the head of the snake, which is a sufficiently violent way to handle the situation, but it's at least still a human versus snake scenario, right? I'm going to pick up the snake and swallow it, and eat it. People don't do that. Normal people don't do that, right? So you have that sense of Peter as inhuman, Peter as monster, and that seems to be the room at the end of the world. The computer would appear to be inviting him to identify himself with Peter. Again, one of the questions we were asking last time: what is the computer trying to tell him? What is the program? What message is it trying to give him? What is it trying to teach him? We're told this is supposed to be a teaching program. Well, it would seem to be saying to Ender, look in the mirror, my friend, congratulations, you are Peter, and you are Peter at his most inhuman and most monstrous. This seems to be Graff's interpretation, right? That's why we get that conversation with him and Major Imbu, where he's like, what the heck? What on earth is this computer doing? Why is it showing him? Do you realize what this is going to mean to Ender? So Colonel Graff is flipping out because he does not want the computer to give him that message, by which we seem to be, I think, pretty safely able to draw the conclusion that that's the message, that's how he interprets it, right? That's the message that he takes out of it. That, of course, is confirmed when he goes down to Earth and talks to Valentine, and what he's trying to get from Valentine, and ultimately what he gets her to do, is to write a letter to Ender reassuring him, you're not Peter, right? To try to counteract that connection, which apparently the computer has invited him to do. So this opens up, this, or rather doesn't open it up, it really brings to the surface, really emphasizes at this point in the story that fundamental question, and it's a question that we've seen Ender have of himself several times before. How different is he from Peter, right? I mean, we know that Peter, what's the phrase that Colonel Graff uses? He calls Peter one of the most dominant influences in Ender's life, right? And we can see that, right? I mean, if as we're going along and we're following the mind of Ender, and we're hearing his own internal thoughts, remember, like he still has a monitor on that we're using, right? So we're like Colonel Graff, not looking over Ender's shoulder, but hearing what's inside his head. Anyway, we see what's going on in Ender's mind, and we see how often Peter comes up. I mean, it's clear that Peter is a kind of standard that he appeals to all the time, right? I mean, it's one of the things that he always comes back to. He does something that makes him upset, and he's like, I'm just like Peter, right? Or he thinks, when Bonzo hits him, and he is glad that he can take a beating without, crying and carrying on and everything. And he says, I thank you, Peter, for giving me this gift. Anyway, there's lots of ways in which we can see Peter looming very large in Ender's mind. And then again, this connection is really sort of foisted on us here at the end. But of course, Ender's not like Peter, right? We know he was selected because of his differences from Peter, right? Peter was rejected from battle school because of, apparently, what I've been calling his inhumanity, because he was too cruel, because he was too violent. Ender is not like Peter, and therefore has been accepted, right? And that's Valentine's whole message. He's not at all, he's nothing like Peter. And I don't know about you, but doesn't it sure sound like Valentine is trying to convince herself at the end? The extreme language that she uses. It's one thing to say, Ender isn't really the same as Peter. They kind of look alike in some ways. There are certain ways in which their actions are sort of similar, but they're not exactly the same. That's a safe thing to say, or at least, you can sure make an argument about that. But to say what Valentine was saying at the end, you're not at all, not even a tiny little bit. He's nothing like Peter. Not true. It's not true at all that he's nothing like Peter. But anyway, so. But again, that's a very much a question that the last section that we were talking about really invites us to be asking, really invites us to look at. And let me pause here and look at some of the questions. Yeah, April Harwood has a really good question. It seems like Peter, thinking of the Peter in the mirror there, that Peter is eating Valentine in a way. Remember the snake, when Ender does kiss it there at the end of chapter 9, it turns into Valentine, right? And Ender makes that link too. He's right, it can't be Valentine. And he thinks back to all the times he's killed the snake. And he's like, it's like he dissociates himself from that idea. He cannot allow himself to think that the snake is Valentine because he thinks back over how many times he killed the snake, right? So yeah, April, that on the one hand, we're kind of invited to think that way, and yet again, Ender sort of shuts that off, right? But anyway, seems like Peter's eating Valentine in a way. If the game can access Peter's current picture, does the computer know about their online activities? It's a great question, April. I mean, you'd think no, but who knows? I mean, in a sense, I think the most mysterious character in this entire book is the computer that's generating the fantasy game, April. As far as having explanations for how it knows what it knows and what it's doing, I don't have an answer for that, and the book doesn't give an answer for that. Remember, Major Imbu does not have any good answers for this. But it is a really good question. And of course, April, you're right. It's one of the other things that we know that Ender doesn't know, that Valentine has become Peter's tool, right? She has become his instrument. That moment when Valentine is crying and saying that Ender didn't give in, right? He didn't give in to Peter. He didn't give in to being like Peter. And it's clear that she herself is feeling guilty because she feels like she has given in, right? That she has sold out, that she has changed her allegiance from being Ender's protector against Peter, and now she's helping Peter and supporting Peter and working with Peter, and she feels like by doing so she's betrayed Ender and she's sold out. So April, I think that we are invited to sort of interpret it that way, that we can see sort of Valentine disappearing into Peter. But notice also how different that is, right? That is, it's not Valentine looking and seeing Peter, right? In a sense, there's a kind of triumph in that. Remember, again, what she defined as victory was not giving in, right? And you could say, even if she's the snake and Peter's eaten her, she's not become Peter, right? To be his victim, to be consumed by him, to be taken in and made his tool, is not to give in completely. That is to say, it's not to change. She's not looking in a mirror and seeing Peter, right? She still remains, even in that mirror image, she remains different from him. Victimized by him. I mean, I'm not saying it's cheerful, but it's not transformation, right? Yeah, I think there's certainly a lot more that we could do with that. But here, let's see, because you guys have lots of comments tonight. Oh, this is great. Let's see. Yes, and Tom Hillman makes a really great point. Again, thinking back to the computer there. How this whole process, the process of, especially with the revelation of the picture of Peter, how this shows that the computer program is not entirely under the control of the controllers. And that's right. Tom, in some sense, I think the computer program, the computer which is making the fantasy game, is one of the only, is the only character in the book which lies genuinely outside the struggle. You know, you've got the struggle between the individual and humanity, the struggles between humans and monsters, and those things are true in several different ways, right? We talk about, you know, humanity in the sense of the collective, the whole of humanity on the one hand versus individuals on the other hand. Between humanity in the sense of humaneness, you know, the sort of the attitude of being like a human instead of being monstrous. The struggle between humanity and monsters. This, of course, playing out on the on the most literal and historical level, as you know, in the wars with the buggers. You know, you've got the astronauts and the buggers and astronauts thing, right? You've the monsters on the one hand and the people over there. But we were already looking in the first class about the ways in which that struggle and that conception of the struggle, that defining humanity by that struggle, the desire to defend humanity against the buggers, has already succeeded in a very significant dehumanizing effect, right? So you have the human race as a whole sort of giving in to this really rampant cruelty, you know, that like by all means let's encourage young children to use weapons, and let's, you know, encourage people to play these, in the end, really sadistic games. I mean, they sort of acknowledge, you know, it's pretty poor sport to be the kid who has to pretend to be the bugger, because the kids who are being the astronauts are encouraged not just to defeat you, but to be cruel to you. So again, we've got the whole humanity and monster thing going on. You've got the soldiers and the teachers in battle school. You've got the humans and the buggers. There are so many different, you know, sort of tensions and conflicts and things being worked out. But the computer, the fantasy game computer, is the one thing which seems to be totally separate from that, which does not seem to have a stake in that game at all. In any of those tensions, in any of those conflicts. So in that way, Tom, I find it really fascinating. It's almost like it is the one objective thing, and I think in a sense, because of that, and Tom in particular, because of that scene in which Graff is completely wigging out about what the computer has done, and Major Imbu is like, look, you know, who knows? We can't really control it. That's one of the reasons why I really love those scenes, actually, because I think it gives them a kind of richness. Because again, the computer, it's like the computer is the only objective creature, you know, in the story, and I think that really adds a fascinating element. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Oh, good. Let's see. Sorry, I'm again sort of scanning through people's comments here. I know I can't. I'm sorry that I don't have time to respond to everyone's comments, but we have a lot of people here with us, and you guys are being especially active tonight. It's just that it's great, but hard to keep up with. Yeah, Megan asks, maybe acknowledging your inner monster makes you less monstrous. Is this why Ender has to kiss the snake? Megan, a great question. I mean, the kissing of the snake there at the end of that scene, and at the end of chapter 9, is a real moment. What does it mean exactly? That is, since on the one hand, the shift in his approach from immediate violence to kindness, right, gentleness, even acceptance, is clearly a reversal in policy, and would seem to be a choice of humanity as against monstrousness, right? I'm not going to be the thing that just goes in and stomps on heads right away. Instead, I'm going to be the thing which tries to embrace and understand and kiss, right? Though remember, we're told that Ender didn't plan to do that, right? The kissing wasn't a strategy. He wasn't sure what he was going to do. He was going to let it. There were two other things mentioned, right? He had originally intended to just let it bite him, that it was in fact a suicidal impulse in a sense, but also he was also thinking, oh, or maybe he would eat it, right? Those would be two extreme reactions, right? I'm not going to keep doing this. I'm not going to go in and stomp on the snake and see Peter in the mirror, right? I'm going to break out of this whole I am truly Peter, I am in fact like Peter, I am that kind of an inhuman monster. I'm going to break out of that cycle. He's got two ways to break out, right? One is to give himself up, right? To allow himself to be destroyed, to say, I'm not going to resist. In which case, he would be dead, but not a monster. Or the other is to embrace being a monster, right? To say, okay, that's me, right? That Peter with the snake hanging out of his mouth is me. Fine, I'll eat the snake, right? I'll make myself. I'll eat the snake and I'll grow out my hair and I'll be just like Peter, right? I didn't say a thing about growing out his hair, but anyway. So those seem to be two almost diametrically opposed responses, though both of them designed to break the pattern, right? To break the way that he had always approached this room. And in the end, he ends up doing, spontaneously, without plan, without design, a third thing, which is to kiss the snake, to embrace it. So again, that would seem to be clearly, it's obviously a change in policy, but the symbolism of it seems to be a little bit clouded. That is, it's not cut and dry. It's because it's a snake. And it's a snake, what's more, which has identified itself as death, since it's a snake and death that he's cuddling up to and kissing there at the end, that it's no longer just a clean-cut, I'm going to turn from violence and turn towards love and acceptance instead. It's not just that, right? It's just, okay, love and acceptance of death? Really? Like that? Okay. That's, again, it's symbolically, it seems not really clear-cut. And then it's, of course, further complicated when the snake turns into Valentine. Valentine, snake, death, again, how does that work? That's not really clear to me. And I don't think it's clear to Ender either. Anyway, we'll look at some more of this stuff as we go here. I do want to get to today's class content sometime before we're almost they're not quite at the halfway point of the class today, and I've yet to do slide 1. I think my old tendencies are coming back with a vengeance to try to humble me for my my cockiness after I got through my unprecedented 21 slides last time. Okay. Let's see. Sorry, just looking ahead in comments here. All right, I'm going to have to skip ahead. Yeah. Sean Smith says, Sean, you said the question that I just end with really well. Is embracing the part of himself that he hates, how is that different from becoming a monster? Exactly. Is it kissing the snake? Does that mean I'm distancing myself from monstrosity, right? I'm not going to stomp on the snake and then be like Peter, or is it embracing it? Symbolically, it could work either way, and that seems it's one of the things that makes that situation really, that whole scene there at the end of chapter 9 really complicated and hard to sort out. So again, what I want to do is turn back to the rest of the action outside the game to help us, as a kind of commentary in a sense, because it's really the whole point of the rest of the action is that it's just a kind of commentary on the fantasy game, which is obviously the central point of the whole story. I'm being a little sarcastic there, but yeah. Okay, good. All right, just a couple other things that I wanted to mention because they lead into where I want to start today, because we're totally going to start today's class pretty soon. We're almost ready to begin. Remember Dink's warning, right? That conversation he has with Dink Meeker when Dink says, remember the teachers are the enemy, right? It's not, this isn't about the buggers, it's about us versus the teachers. In that conversation, remember, Ender revealed the fact that he's okay with being a tool because he thinks that the end is worth it. It's like a means and ends question. The end of protecting humanity from the buggers is worth my own sacrifice of selfhood, right? So I will submit myself to become a tool, to be made a good soldier in order to help humanity defeat the buggers. And Dink questions that. You're not being the tool of humanity as a whole, right? You are not saving the humans from the buggers. Instead, you are being a tool for the fleet, right? That this is the real situation, at least the situation that Dink fears, and as we will see, by the end of the book, fears with some reason, is that in the end, what could happen is the game room made real. That is, these people who are, like the you have the battle school as a kind of microcosm of the earth, right? These soldiers and people from different countries and from different backgrounds who are brought together and who, have a lot in common, but they're set against each other, right? And they're sort of with artificial definitions, that are imposed upon them. They are set against each other and made to war against each other. And remember, Dink is the one who says, we're not the enemy. It's not the other students who are the enemy. It's the teachers who are the enemy. And the fleet is manipulating us. The fleet is perpetuating this stuff about the Bugger War because they want to maintain their power, and they know that if they don't, once the Bugger War is over, things are going to split up, and you're going to end up having the people, just as Dink and Ender are one day going to be enemies in the battle room, commanding different armies. So too, they could be commanding, real armies on Earth as civil war breaks out. This is the situation that Dink is. So again, the point that Dink makes is it's not as simple as all of humanity unified against the buggers, right? So you've got all of humanity in this category, and you're going to be a tool to save everybody, to save this thing called humanity, right? This abstraction called the human race. And Dink says, at the end of the day, it's not about the human race. There isn't anybody who represents humanity. Everybody represents a portion of humanity. As he points out, the teachers are representing the fleet. The fleet. They're representing America, and they're representing themselves. They're not the spokespeople of the human race. So that conversation with Dink sort of invites us to question that, to sort of think about that. We'll come back to that later on tonight. We saw Ender's despair and his dehumanization, his own sense of his dehumanization, as he's becoming a tool. We see that despair deepen when Val becomes a tool, when Valentine becomes a tool, when she is made by the teachers to write that letter. He reads the letter, he knows it's from Valentine, but the very genuineness of that letter makes it worse, right? He hates it because he knows she has given in, right, to use her own language. She's sold out. She has submitted to become a tool of the teachers against him. That's how he sees it. The teachers are the enemy, right? Dink taught him that. The teachers are the enemy, and he recognizes, yes, it's true, the teachers are the enemy. And Valentine has become their tool. Not the tool of humanity as a whole. Again, that's the appeal that Graff makes to her as well. Not the tool of humanity as a whole. The tool of some people against other people, and in this case, against Ender himself. So remember his reaction to this? He's not going to play anymore. Right? Forget it. He's not going to be their tool anymore. So he was content to be their tool. He thought it was a worthwhile. It was a sacrifice, but a worthwhile sacrifice for him to become their tool. Now he's not going to play anymore, except he does, right? In playing the fantasy game, he's playing their game. It's not his game. It's not Ender's game. It's their game. Except, as Tom, as you were just pointing out, it's not the teacher's game either. The game is that game. The fantasy game is on its own, right? It's sort of operating independently. Anyway, he does continue, in fact, playing it. Remember, we were looking at, when he was thinking that way back with the Giant's Drink, right? He's like, forget it, I'm not going to play anymore. Except he does. He can't get himself to stop. It's like, stupid game. Keeps doing the same thing every time. But yet he can't stop himself from going back and going back and going back. He's got to finish the game. He's got to defeat the game. He's got to win. Okay. We're told. I am now officially starting our discussion of Chapter 10. You see? Okay. We're told that Ender is happy, or at least content, after his solving of the puzzle of the room at the end of the world, and that he hasn't played the fantasy game since that day, since the end of Chapter 9. So we get no fantasy game scenes whatsoever in the chapters that we read for today, chapters 10 through 12. So, okay. What then does going through the mirror mean to him? In one way, it's a little hard to understand exactly why Ender seems to feel better after this. Because, again, Graff thinks he understands it. And we see that at the very end of Chapter 9 when Valentine gets her medal, right, or is notified that she's going to get a medal, that she doesn't actually receive a medal and has to destroy the letter and can't tell anybody about it. But anyway, she's told she's going to receive this medal, that her assistance was great and it cured it. Her letter cured Ender. So it seems Graff believes he understands the situation, right? He believes Ender's problem was the whole Peter in the mirror thing, that the computer was telling him that he was Peter and he couldn't handle that. So Graff had the clever plan to go get Valentine to sort of trump that impulse, right? That Valentine's influence over Ender is even more profound than Peter's impact over Ender. So if he has Valentine once again to tell him, as she always told him when he was little, you're not like Peter, that the voice of Valentine saying that will counteract the fears and self-doubt that has been brought up by the game and the Peter in the mirror thing, and it works, right? He gets the letter. As soon as he gets the letter, he goes and he plays the game, and he gets past the room, and he's not looking at Peter in the mirror, and he's not, and he comes out of his despair, and he becomes happy and content, right? So okay, so Graff, everything worked out according to Graff's plan, except we know it didn't. Right? We know that Ender's reaction to Valentine's letter was not reassurance, but a deeper and more profound despair, that the only good thing he still had to cling on to had been taken away from him. Valentine herself had sold out and become an instrument of his enemies against him. That was the spirit with which he went to the room at the end of the world that last time. So it seems pretty obvious to me that Colonel Graff's conclusion is way overly simplistic. That's not, in fact, how it worked. April Harvard asks a really good question again. Is Ender rejecting the teacher's interference in his one good memory by accepting that Valentine is with him wherever he goes? Remember, that's the thought that he left with, that he left the room at the end of the world. When he goes through the mirror and he's got Valentine, he and Valentine are there, Dragon and Unicorn, right, are there, and he feels happy because he feels that Valentine will always be with him. There is a sense, April, in which it seems almost as if he has reclaimed his memory of Valentine from them. I mean, the turn in how he is thinking about Valentine there at the end of that scene compared to what it was before he went in is pretty striking. It seems to have had a transform. What happened in that room, in that fantasy room, at the end of the world, does seem to change his mind. It changed the way that he looks at Valentine and at his situation. Contentment came from it. How? Why? What does going through the mirror mean to him exactly? Because it's certainly not simply he used to be confronted by Peter, but now not, right? Where that image of Peter, you are a Peter-like monster, Ender, where that message used to be, it's been cleared away, and that's become a door, right? So instead, he goes through, Peter has been set aside, and he's able to go through a door past the end of the world into a brave new Peter-free world, right? Except that's obviously the wrong interpretation. Why? Remember why? How do we know that that interpretation is wrong? How's it wrong? Yes, Sean, exactly. Sean Smith remembers everybody. The path that he walks in is lined with people, and they all have Peter's face. And remember, he does. Yeah, Kay and April both remember it also, and he doesn't notice. Right? His eyes are filled with tears, so that he doesn't even notice that everybody in the crowd that's cheering him has Peter's face. Right? He's not stepped beyond. He's not set aside Peter. Now we have the Peter crowd. But you see the implication? You see the implication of everybody in the crowd having Peter's face, right? Remember we had the individual versus humanity? Now humanity, the whole crowd, they're all Peters, right? Everybody. Okay, so I guess that's better, right? It's not just me. It's not just that I'm Peter. Everybody's Peter, right? But this Peter-like humanity is applauding him, and that scene, that triumphal entry of Ender, that adulation of Ender by the crowd, seems to prefigure the end of the story, right? That he's going to be the savior of humanity. Everyone is going to know his name. Everybody is going to be cheering him. But again, the implication, Peter's face, the implication of that is that humanity, which is cheering him, is a monster. They're all the same ones. And not like that individually each person is a monster. No. They each have the same face, right? They are that collective group. It's one of the, I was talking about the collective back in the first class. That scene of the crowds along Ender's path there at the end of chapter 9 is the closest we ever get to an actual depiction of something like the human collective, humanity as a whole. And humanity as a whole is given Peter's face. So that, I think, is very interesting. Tommy, exactly. Tommy McGuire says, in a sense, by setting up the IF, they're all manipulative monsters too. Yeah, exactly. Remember what defines Peter. It's easy to be sort of too simplistic in saying Peter is a monster, like, monstrosity, thy name is Peter, right? That all that is cruel, all that is sadistic, all that enjoys the pain of others. But remember, it's not just that. What Peter is primarily about, as he will cheerfully tell you, is control, right? That is, what Peter does more than anything else is make other people his tools. And we see his whole plan to become hegemon, the 12-year-old who's going to take over the world. His whole plan rests upon him, as I was saying last time, using all the rest of humanity as a tool. So, Tommy, it's exactly in that sense that I think that that image of the entirety of humanity wearing Peter's face works. It's not that Ender is like Peter, which would mean that the two of them are freaks, right, separated from the rest of humanity. On the one hand, it sort of looks like that's what it means. There are times in which we're certainly invited to see Peter separated from the rest of humanity, Ender separated from the rest of the humanity, and the two of them tied together. But all of humanity wears Peter's face, because all of humanity, remember, that was the whole premise back in chapters 1 through 6 in the first class where we talked about this. All of humanity. What does humanity do? It uses people as tools. It uses individuals as tools for its own preservation. Brandon points out it's interesting that meanwhile Peter is in a sense multiplying back on Earth, not by his manipulation of people and his control of people. He's making others into sort of extensions of himself. In a sense. Okay, good. Um, all right. Yeah, it's interesting. Jonathan Spencer says, Ender wins. He's beaten the thing, right? He's gone through. He's gone past the end of the world. He has triumphed, and what we see as an immediate result of his triumph, as Jonathan points out here, is the monstrous part of humanity winning. Or even like the monstrosity of humanity coming to the surface, right? As in his victory, um, and that he is the tool that brings that about, or at least Jonathan, I would, the other thing I'd potentially hold as, or at least reveals it, right? Though again, remember, he doesn't notice. Um, anyway, okay. Um, slide one. Slide one. Now that we're almost an hour into class, slide. Are you ready? Do you think we should start slide one? Are we ready for slide one? Don't worry, I don't have 21 tonight, but I have a lot. Anyway, okay. Let's move on. I want to look at his actions in this new phase. Post. What does Ender look like after the end of the world? What do we see him acting, and how do we see him talking? Well, when he becomes a commander, I think one of the most striking things about his early days as a commander is how he treats Bean. Excellent, he says. At least I have one soldier who can figure things out. Ender could see resentment growing in the way the other shoulders shifted their weight and glanced at each other, the way they avoided looking at Bean. Why am I doing this? What does this have to do with being a good commander, making one boy the target of all the others? Just because they did it to me, why should I do it to him? Ender wanted to undo his taunting of the boy, wanted to tell the others that the little one needed their help and friendship more than anyone else. But of course Ender couldn't do that, not on the first day. On the first day, even his mistakes had to look like part of a brilliant plan. Okay. We certainly do see this cycle of abuse thing going on, right? That as soon as he is put in power over other people, he treats them as he was treated. We see him what he says to Bean and how he says it is almost exactly the way that Ender was treated by Colonel Graff on the launch, right? To isolate him from the other launchies. But again, like I said in that first class, the difference is that we see Ender's self-doubt, right? He is self-conscious. He's self-aware. What makes Ender different? What makes Ender different from Peter? He has the gift of self-loathing, right? It sounds like a horrible thing to say, but he regrets what he does, right? So we see him doing this on the one hand, but we also see him questioning it. But the question really lingers. Why am I doing this? What does this have to do with being a good commander, making one boy the target of all the others? I don't think those are rhetorical questions. I think those are questions to which we are invited to consider the answers. What does making one boy the target of all the others have to do with being a good commander? If he's acting like Graff, what do we learn from that? What does that show us? What does it teach us about Graff? What does it show us about Ender? How does it help us to understand? How does it help us to understand Ender's situation? Yeah, Gerald says Ender learned how effectively it worked on him, and so he is replicating the pattern. Well, Gerald, we'll see. It kind of gets around to something like that, but that isn't where he. But that isn't where he starts exactly. Yeah. Kay has a really great observation, as usual. Kay points out that Graff wasn't focused on uniting the school. Remember when and I think it was Anderson was talking about Ender being a disease? No, it wasn't Anderson. It was one of the other nameless military persons saying that Ender is a disease in that launch group. And Graff says, no, I was the disease, right? I did this. And you're right, Kay, you did that for Ender's sake. Graff is perfectly willing, as we see, and as becomes more and more dramatized in this, to throw everything under the bus, to throw all the rest of the soldiers, the entire training regimen of the battle school, everything, to throw that all away for the sake of Ender, right? That's all he cares about is Ender. If he succeeds with Ender and everything else goes to hell, that's fine, right? So you're right, that's Graff's priority. That's not what Ender's doing here. Ender is certainly not throwing everything away, willing to throw the rest of his soldiers away for being. So I do agree. I think that that's a significant difference. Look at this is later from the confrontation between Ender and Graff. This is right before he is given his assignment to fight Salamander army. And again, I want to see what does this stuff reveal about Ender's attitude and about what he thinks is going on here. Graff is asking him about the fantasy game. Tell me why you don't play it. Graff is really upset because he really wanted us to get more scenes so that we in this class could talk about it a lot more. Ender says, because I won. You never win everything in that game. There's always more. I won, insists Ender. Ender, we want you to be as happy as possible, but if you want to make me the best soldier possible, go down and look at the standings. Look at the all-time standings. So far, you're doing an excellent job with me. Congratulations. Now, when are you going to put me up against a good army? Graff's set lips turned to a smile, and he shook a little with silent laughter. Okay. What do we see about Ender's attitude here? I think it's fascinating. Again, remember, we started with Ender happy, with Ender content. At least that's what the teachers said, right? That's what they saw. And Graff saying, oh, now we're going to have to destroy that happiness. But look what we see Ender doing here, right? When he says to Ender, we want you to be as happy as possible. And Ender cuts across him. He says, no, you want to make me the best soldier possible. But I don't, that last question, all the way up through, you want to make me the best soldier possible, go down, look at the standings, so far you're doing an excellent job with me, congratulations. That congratulations could be absolutely dripping with sarcasm, right, with irony. He could say that with hatred, right? There could be loathing dripping from that word. But his next question, now when are you going to put me up against a good army? Doesn't sound sarcastic. That is, it sounds kind of willing tool-ish, right? That is to say, as if he is embracing, I want to be the best soldier possible. And I recognize that what you want is to make me the best soldier possible, and I am like being complicit with that. I mean, Lee, I agree with you that congratulations sounds sardonic, but again, I have a hard time reconciling it with the next statement. Now, when are you going to put me up against a good army? He does seem to care at this stage now. Again, we get to a different place by the end of chapter 12, but at this point, he seems to believe, first of all, he recognizes they're trying to make me into a good soldier, right? That's what he says. And he seems interested in being a good soldier, I think. Yeah, April. I like April's interpretation here. April says, I also feel the demand for a good army is a challenge to the teacher's ability to do their jobs. I agree. There's a kind of rivalry with them, right? There's a sense in which the way I take that, April, very much along the lines that you were just suggesting, very much a sense in which this sounds like I'm competing with you. Remember, he's still, teachers of the enemy, right? Dink's message. He says, you're the enemy and I'm winning, right? You never win anything in that game. There's always more. I won. Right? Forget it. I won, right? And then what he seems to be going on to say, and I'm beating you, right? You say you want to make into you want to make me into the best soldier possible. It's almost like he's becoming the best soldier possible in spite of them rather than because of them, or there seems to be still this kind of this kind of re rebellion. But again, he's not rebelling against their system, against their game. Anyway, yeah. I agree with Kay. Kay Ben Abraham says he's keeping Graff out of his inner self, though. I think the question could be read as a defense in that way. Yes, I think so. But again, notice that there's still, at the very least, there's the overt gesture towards complacent toolhood, right? You brought me here to make me a tool. You said as much at the beginning. I can see that you're trying to make me into a tool. Fine. I'm going along with this. Again, I think we can see levels of irony there. We can see degrees of resistance from Ender there, but it's not overt. Back to Bean. This is the end of that first practice. Ender reached down and grabbed the front of his uniform and shoved him into the wall. When I say I work a certain way, Bean, then that's the way I work. Bean just smiled. Ender let go of him and walked away. When he got to his room, he laid down on his bed and trembled. What am I doing? My first practice session, and I'm already bullying people the way Bonzo did? And Peter, shoving people around, picking on some poor little kid so the others will have somebody they all hate. Sickening. Everything I hated in a commander, and I'm doing it. Is it some law of human nature that you inevitably become whatever your first commander was? I can quit right now if that's so. Over and over he thought of the things he did and said in his first practice with his new army. Why couldn't he talk like he always did in his evening practice group? No authority except excellence. Never had to give orders, just made suggestions. But that wouldn't work, not with an army. His informal practice group didn't have to learn to do things together. They didn't have to develop a group feeling. They never had to learn how to hold together and trust each other in battle. They didn't have to respond instantly to commands. Notice Ender's definition of an army here, right? What will make an army? What will make a good army? They will be a good army if they develop a group feeling to do things together perfectly, if they never have to learn how to hold together, to trust each other in battle. I think of that image of Dragon Army in their final battle, actually tied together with Bean's string, right? That's, yeah, they never have to learn to hold together. They can move in a tight formation, not only without ever having practiced formation, but without even touching each other because they're tied together, right? It's perfect, right? It's the perfect fruition of Ender's vision here of an army. They have to trust each other in battle. They have to respond instantly to commands. Perfect discipline, the commander with perfect authority, and the group with a perfect collective reactions. A couple of you, Sean, I think, before, and Luke, saying, this isn't what his first commander did. It's not what his first commander succeeded in doing, but it is what Bonzo was attempting to do. That is, remember we're given this very obvious contrast between Bonzo, Madrid, and Rose the Nose, right? The one who is super authoritarian, and the other of which is completely lax with no discipline whatsoever. And Ender objects to Bonzo not because he maintains authority or attempts to maintain authority, but because of the ways in which he fails to do that. Right? Those are the criticisms that Ender is always making internally of Bonzo. Right? The thing about not having anybody be naked in front of Petra, he says, Ender says, is stupid. Right? That it divides the army. He sees ways in which he would more successfully bring people together. The way in which Bonzo refuses to use Ender, right? That's not only uh, stupid, it's not only foolish in the sense that it's depriving them of a potential weapon, and of course, as it turns out, a pretty good one, but uh, but that it's like for spite, for some really obscure and perverse kind of honor, he's doing this. Well, um, so again, what Ender criticizes is not what Bonzo is trying to do, but how he goes about doing it in ways which are unsuccessful, right? Again, what Ender is regretting here is, why is he setting everybody against Bean, right? It would seem, if he is worried, if the anxiety of the commander is that they will hate him, Ender, and not listen to him, right? If ultimately he as a commander is feeling insecure, he can bolster that. He can bolster his position by giving them somebody else to hate, right? But sickening. Everything I hated in a commander, he says, to divide in that way. Okay, so yes, what they're going to do, as Sharon Hoff points out, what he wants to do, his vision there of what an army needs to do, are to become buggers, right? That's exactly how the bugger fleet operates, as he will see. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. Now, my next question: how well is Ender really understanding what the teachers and what's going on with them and what they're doing with him? It was the teachers who had done it, Ender said, and it wasn't an accident. Ender realized that now. It was a strategy. Graff had deliberately set him up to be separate from the other boys, made it impossible for him to be close to them. This is still when he's thinking about how he treated Bean, so this is just a little bit after that last passage we were looking at. And he began now to suspect the reasons behind it. It wasn't to unify the rest of the group. In fact, it was divisive. Graff had isolated Ender to make him struggle, to make him prove, not that he was competent, but that he was far better than everyone else. That was the only way he could win respect and friendship. It made him a better soldier than he would ever have been otherwise. It also made him lonely, afraid, angry, untrusting, and maybe those traits too made him a better soldier. That's what I'm doing to you, Bean. I'm hurting you to make you a better soldier in every way, to sharpen your wit, to intensify your effort, to keep you off balance, never sure what's going to happen next, so you always have to be ready for anything, ready to improvise, determined to win no matter what. I'm also making you miserable. That's why they brought you to me, Bean, so you could be just like me, so you could grow up to be just like the old man. And me, am I supposed to grow up like Graff? Fat and sour and unfeeling, manipulating the lives of little boys so they turn out factory perfect, generals and admirals ready to lead the fleet in defense of the homeland? You get all the pleasures of the puppeteer until you get a soldier who can do more than anyone else. You can't have that. It spoils the symmetry. You must get him in line, break him down, isolate him, beat him until he gets in line with everyone else. Okay. He was doing well there for a while, right? Again, my question is, what does he understand? How does he understand what the teachers are doing and why? The first paragraph sounds right on, based on what we know, what we've heard from Graff's own lips. That's exactly right. Lee Smith says, the first two paragraphs, yes, but not the third. Not the third. Exactly. A soldier who can do more than getting Ender in line, beating him down until he gets in line with everyone else, is exactly what Graff does not want. Ender doesn't fully get it. He gets that Graff is pushing him. He says that he understands that Graff wants Ender to be the best soldier that he can be. Kay Ben Abraham is pointing to this sort of paradox, there's like the actual contradiction. On the one hand, making him far better than everyone else, but then saying beat him until he gets into line with everyone else. He's um, he's not he's still not really seeing the whole picture. He's still in seeing that his teachers are his enemies. He gets that idea that he's against the teachers, but he doesn't quite understand what it means. He believes that he's playing a game against the teachers, but he doesn't realize what game he's playing, right? He's playing the wrong game, or he's thinking the rules of the game are different from what they are. And you'll see this comes out. This comes out off and on. This is in chapter 12, so this is right after his fight with Bonzo, when he's just been given his assignment to fight the two armies at once, right? Everything they can do to beat me, thought Ender. Everything they can think of. Change all the rules. They don't care, just so they beat me. Well, I'm sick of the game. No game is worth Bonzo's blood, pinking the water on the bathroom floor. Ice me. Send me home. I don't want to play anymore. And yet, he's on his way to the game room, right? As before, with the fantasy game, he's sounding here a lot like he was right before he went to the room at the end of the world for the last time. And as he is here going to the battle room for the last time, no game is worth this. I don't want to play anymore. But again, notice the fallacy still lurking behind Ender's thinking. They'll do anything they can to beat me. They don't care, just so they beat me. He seems to believe the teacher's goal, that what winning looks like from the teacher's point of view is Ender defeated, is Ender beaten down and put into line with everybody else. But of course we know that is exactly the opposite of their point of view, exactly the opposite of their goal. They want to make him stand out even more. They want to separate him more completely from everyone. They desperately want him to win. They're not changing the rules in order to defeat him. They're changing the rules hoping that he will persevere and learn how to win against impossible odds. So again, we see he doesn't get it. He doesn't get the game that's being played. He's accepting the rules of the game. Remember, that was what the dragons drink. That's an interesting slip. That's what the giants drink was all about. Dragon Army is kind of like the giants drink in some way. That's what the giants drink was all about, right? Not accepting the parameters of the game. And we looked at that. He's got to think individually, right? He's got to he's got to think outside the box. He's got to go outside the parameters. He's got to do the impossible. And that's where he's pushed there in the same way at the end of his battle school experience here, right? And it was the same thing with the end of the world too, in a sense, right? That picking up the snake and kissing it is going outside the parameters. You have an enemy, right? Who rises up and says, "I am death," right? And then it's going to attack you. Well, what do you do then? You kill it, right? Obviously. He had to go outside those parameters in order to make that work as well, to be able to pass through the looking glass into the alternate universe. As before, everything seems stacked up against him, and he hates it, but he's still not completely going outside the parameters, right? He says, "I don't want to play anymore," but yet he does. So why did he play? Why did he go to the battle room this day? He could have just not gone to the battle room. Why did he go? He says to Bean, "I don't care about their game anymore, Bean. I'm not going to play it anymore. No more practices, no more battles. They can put their little slips of paper on the floor all they want, but I won't go. I decided that before I went through the door today. That's why I had you go for the gate. I didn't think it would work, but I didn't care. I just wanted to go out in style." I just wanted to go out in style, he says. like in the fantasy game. Like in here in particular, I'm thinking less of the Giants drink and more of the room at the end of the world. He said he wouldn't play anymore, but he is playing, right? He's playing their game, literally in that moment, playing their game, their fantasy game. And he goes there and he goes out. He goes out in style. Yeah, Luke says he's not being true. There are more stylish ways to go out. He still wants to win. Yeah. In the end, he's not just playing; he's playing to win, right? Remember his comment at the end of the game, his comment to Major Anderson at the end of that last battle. I beat you again, sir. Right? You're not competing against me. Yes, he was. Ender believes that he was. Ender believes that's what it was all about. Ender believes that he has cheated in the last battle and that the teachers may be mad at him for doing what he did. That what he was doing was an act of rebellion, right? This is how you play the game when you don't want to play anymore, right? Forget it. So he does go outside. He goes outside the parameters. It's how he ends. Like with the Giants drink, like with the room at the end of the world, like his final battle against the two armies, he goes outside the parameters, right? And remember, as with those other cases, they were only assumed parameters, right? That is, the giant says, choose which one. If you choose the right one, you can go to fairyland, right? So if you believe the giant, all you can do is drink one of the two glasses of liquid. But that's if you believe the giant, right? So too, tradition in the battle school had said you had to defeat all the enemy soldiers before you could pass through the gate at the end and win the game. But you can ignore that. You can circumvent that and just go straight for victory. And it turns out the game accepted that as victory, right? That was victory. He did win. And he won by breaking the parameters by going outside the parameters of the game. And you'll notice as well, by the way, that his last victory was self-sacrificial. He was frozen. We'd never seen Ender frozen like that before. But it was self-sacrificial, right? He was he was not one of the soldiers who went forward to the gate. He was one of the soldiers that stayed back, that launched the gate team over there. There are two other things I want to talk about. I've got 5 minutes, so I've got enormous amounts of time. Obviously that's not a problem. But there's one passage that I couldn't pass over. I found this passage in some ways one of the most striking, one of the most moving little vignettes in the book. Actually, I love this moment, and it's the description of Bean when he goes back to his bed the night he says goodbye to Ender. Bean wondered about it as he walked back down the corridor to his own bed. The lights went out just as he reached his bunk. He undressed in darkness, fumbling to put his clothing in a locker he couldn't see. He felt terrible. At first he thought he felt bad because he was afraid of leading an army, but it wasn't true. He knew he'd make a good commander. He felt himself wanting to cry. He hadn't cried since the first few days of homesickness after he got there. He tried to put a name on the feeling that put a lump in his throat and made him sob silently, however much he tried to hold it down. He bit down on his hand to stop the feeling, to replace it with pain. It didn't help. He would never see Ender again. Once he named the feeling, he could control it. He lay back and forced himself to go through the relaxing routine until he didn't feel like crying anymore. Then he dropped off to sleep. His hand was near his mouth. It lay on his pillow hesitantly, as if Bean couldn't decide whether to bite his nails or suck his fingertips. His forehead was creased and furrowed. His breathing was quick and tight. He was a soldier, and if anyone had asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, he wouldn't have known what they meant. I think that there's so many things that we see in this little description of Bean, so many things which serve as a kind of image of not only an image of Ender. I mean, the way in which Bean is so obviously, even in Ender's own mind, a foil for Ender from the first moment of his entry. That we sort of are given a different kind of insight into Ender's situation. But of course, the emphasis there at the end. He's not a normal kid, right? He's not a child. This is not how children behave. Had you asked him the question, which is like the prototypical question to ask a child, right? What do you want to be when you grow up? Ender wouldn't, or Bean wouldn't even have comprehended that question. What on earth does that mean? When I grow up, it's not a question of growing up with him. There's not a question of him being a child. All of those categories don't really apply, and yet we've just seen him there with his hands by his mouth in sleep, as if he doesn't know whether to bite himself or to suck his thumb, right? Is he? We see at the same time, though he's not a normal child, there is still the child about him. This is earlier on we get the Ender looking at him and realizing that he's still seeing. This is a 7-year-old I'm looking at, right? You can still see his round little face, and he's still a kid, quite a small kid, and yet not a regular child anymore. That impulse towards something like, at the very least, anxiety with biting his nails, replacing his sorrow with pain, right? I'm gonna bite myself to inflict pain on myself until as an alternative to crying. Instead of giving way to grief, I'm going to inflict pain on myself. There's something really sort of warped in that, which again I think points to the warping of childhood, of his situation. So anyway, I love this moment, and I think that seeing Bean here in this, it's of course the whole thing is Ender's point of view, right? So we're not being given that same external reminder of Ender, that is, of how the fact that he's still only a child. I mean, he's 11 when he leaves for command school, and he's still prepubescent. He's still losing his baby teeth, presumably, and he is now going off to be an admiral, right? He's going straight to command school. So the sights of Bean help to kind of contextualize and remind us of Ender's situation. Okay, anyway, but now 2 other things I wanted to talk about. Okay, actually there are 3, but I don't have any illusions that I'm going to get to all 3. But let's see if I can do at least 1, and maybe 2. I want to go to the fight with Bonzo and look at what happens here. Of course, on the one hand, his fight with Bonzo is just like the fight with Stilson. I mean, the parallels are very explicit, right? Just in case you weren't making that connection yourself, the text gives us lots of help in putting those 2 things together, the parallel situations with him and his gang, and, of course, the calculation that Ender makes as he did back then. The bathroom wasn't large, and plumbing fixtures protruded everywhere. It had been launched in one piece as a low-orbit satellite, packed full of the water reclamation equipment. It was designed to have no wasted space. It was obvious what their tactics would have to be. Throw the other boy against fixtures until one of them does enough damage that he stops. When Ender saw Bonzo's stance, his heart sank. Bonzo had also taken classes, and probably more recently than Ender. His reach was better, he was stronger, and he was full of hate. He would not be gentle. He will go for my head, thought Ender. He will try above all to damage my brain. And if this fight is long, he's bound to win. His strength can control me. If I'm to walk away from here, I have to win quickly and permanently. He could still feel again the sickening way that Stilson's bones had given way, but this time it will be my body that breaks, unless I can break him first. It's not exactly the same calculation, that is, the terms are not exactly the same, but again, we can see him coming to this, making the same calculation, Ender doing the calculus of survival here. if I'm going to survive, I have to win, and not just win, not just barely win. I can't win a long, close fight. I have to win suddenly, swiftly, and permanently, or else I'm not going to survive at all. You remember the circumstances of the Stilson fight, right? His monitor had just been taken away, and as he's standing there facing Stilson, the first element, the first line of, the first premise of his line of reasoning in his Stilson calculation was, the monitor's gone. They can't see me anymore. That's why they were attacking him, right? I'm on my own. There's nobody else. If I don't protect myself, if I don't take care of this, this is not going to end happily, right? As he says, he's got to take care of it for himself. Remember when he has that interview with Graff, when Graff is interrogating him about Stilson in his house the next day. Remember his mom's response. She's horrified that he would put Stilson in the hospital, after which he dies. You can get that reference. Several of you were objecting in that first class because I kept referring to him killing Stilson, and it just said that he was in the hospital. Well, it was revealed there at the end of chapter 12 that Stilson also died in the hospital. So he has, in fact, beaten two people to death, two other kids to death by the end of chapter 12. Remember, his mom is horrified and says, "You should have called for a teacher. Why didn't you, why didn't you go get help? Why didn't you get a teacher to intervene?" Right? If you were being bullied, obviously the thing to do is to run for help, right? But he didn't run for help. And remember, Graff was pleased, right? Ender thought that he was in trouble when Graff was coming to talk to him about Stilson. But in fact, Graff was delighted, not by what he did, but for the reasons that he did it. Yes, and Luke, you're right. According to Ender's mom, Graff should have given Ender a medal because he did, in fact, kill Stilson. Yes, you're right. We can see, of course, that in the battle school, Graff is working to make this calculation correct. Ender says, look, the only way I can survive, because remember at the time, when we were talking about the Stilson scene back in the first class, there were several of you who were objecting. Several of you who were saying, okay, it's one thing to say, I've got to mess this guy up so badly they stop coming after me. You could say, like, that's really fallacious reasoning, man. I mean, like, there are other options here. This is not, in fact, the only way out of this situation. Well, yeah, if you're thinking like Ender's mom, right, sure, you can go tattle, right? That's a way out of this situation. You can seek protection from others. That would be another way out of this out of the situation. Ender's calculations do seem to be based on the premise, nobody is going to help me. There is no other resource possible that is available to me other than my own resources. Given the fact that I am alone to deal with this with no outside help, how can I survive? What will I have to do to survive? That's the premise of his reasoning. And one can say it was not true at the time. He did have other options, and he did. He could have asked for help from a teacher. Presumably, a teacher at the school would have intervened and prevented Stilson and his gang from beating Ender to a pulp. Depending, I guess, exactly how deep the prejudice against thirds goes in that society. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt and think that they would have broken up the fight had they in fact been alerted. Graff, against stiff resistance even from his superiors, who are coming to threaten him with court-martial and execution. This is a capital court-martial. He is going to be on trial for his life. Graff will be on trial for his own life if Ender is harmed in this situation. So Graff is putting everything on the line in order to make that initial premise of Ender's calculations true. When Ender Wiggin holds our fleets in his control, when he must make the decisions that bring us victory or destruction, will there be military police to come save him if things get out of hand? I fail to see the connection, obviously, but the connection is there. Ender Wiggin must believe that no matter what happens, no adult will ever, ever step in to help him in any way. He must believe to the core of his soul that he can only do what he and the other children work out for themselves. If he does not believe that, then he will never reach the peak of his abilities. He will never become the perfect tool of humanity. Okay. So again, he wants to institutionalize that assumption that Ender made at the beginning of the book. He has to believe that he is alone. He has to be isolated. He has to be acting completely as an individual, separate from the entire rest of humanity, in order for him to become the perfect tool that humanity needs to save humanity. Right? So we see the irony here. Right? I mean, we can see the way in which this is working. Look at Ender's conclusion after the fight. There was no doubt now in Ender's mind. There was no help for him. Whatever he faced, now and forever, no one would save him from it. And you can see Graff in the background. Good job, Ender! You know, like there's Graff high-fiving people, right? Ender got it. He has learned the lesson. Graff has won. Hooray! There was no help for him. Whatever he faced now and forever, no one would save him from it. Peter might be scum, but Peter had been right. Always right. The power to cause pain is the only power that matters. The power to kill and destroy. Because if you can't kill, then you are always subject to those who can. And nothing and no one will ever save you. Well, that's depressing. I got a really interesting email this afternoon from Kristen. How Kristen was pointing out, she was telling me she was reading this. Oh, Kristen, you're here. Cool. Well, Kristen, you were telling me earlier today that you were reading this in the Kindle version. Now, I'm not a Kindle reader myself, but Kristen was telling me that when you read the Kindle version, you can turn on comments. You can see passages in the book that other people have favorited, that they've emphasized, that they've chosen as passages that they really liked. And she said as she was reading through this passage, this paragraph, was the most liked paragraph, the most underlined paragraph in the entire Kindle edition, that 4,000 people had emphasized this passage. And it's certainly a striking moment, but Kristen was sort of confessing to me that she was finding that a little bit creepy and depressing, that this really sort of nihilistic view that, this, what seems to be Ender's submission to monstrosity, right? Yeah, I'm like Peter. Peter's got it right? In fact, the only way to survive is to be like Peter. Because you see, that now becomes explicitly connected to this, and it is indeed the logical extension of Colonel Graff's argument, right? If the only thing that can make him the perfect tool for humanity is to isolate him from humanity, by definition, that means dehumanizing him. In other words, in order to become the perfect tool for humanity, you have to become a monster. You have to become separate from the rest of humanity. You have to become different, but not just different. You have to become ruthless. You have to be willing to kill and destroy. You have to be wanting to be not to be subject to those who can kill and destroy. That the desire, his desire for self-preservation, which turns into this I will sort of accept except of course we know he doesn't accept this. We see him weeping, in the next scene. Again, Peter is okay with this. Ender's not okay with this. As always, we see Ender still being clinging, in a sense, to humanity, that is, to being human. Peter is already a monster, as we know. He's the prototypical monster in this story. But he's also, as we've seen, the most individual. He's the only one who has successfully separated himself from humanity. The one who steps aside, the only one who turns the tables and is the individual using the collective humanity as a tool for his ends instead of submitting themselves to be used as tools. Peter is the only non-tool in the whole story, the only person who will not be a tool for anyone else. Therefore, there seems to be a link, at least in this part of the story here, we're invited to connect being an individual with being a monster. Being separate from the whole, being separate from humanity, is in some sense, by definition, monstrous. Look at what this is Major Imbu and Colonel Anderson talking, now Colonel instead of Major Anderson, talking at the very end of chapter 12. The kid is scary. Ender Wiggin isn't a killer. This is Major Imbu defending him. He just wins thoroughly. If anybody's going to be... No, wait, I think that's Anderson, actually. If anybody's going to be scared, let it be the buggers. Makes you almost feel sorry for them, knowing Ender's going to be coming after them. The only one I feel sorry for is Ender, but not sorry enough to suggest they ought to let up on him. I just got access to the material that Graff's been getting all this time, about fleet movements, that sort of thing. I used to sleep easy at night. Anderson now sees that he now sees the end towards which Graff was moving, right? He was questioning Graff's means before. Now that he sees the ends that Graff was aiming at, he is now okay with Graff's means, much more okay with Graff's means. But again, notice, why is it? Why do the teachers, his enemies, why are the teachers making him a monster? Why are they wanting to push him to be this? Because they're afraid of monsters, right? They're going to make him into a monster that's so scary, it almost makes you feel sorry for the buggers, for the monsters, knowing that Ender's going to be coming after them. They're making the perfect monster, the monster to trump their monsters. There's a way in which we see a parallel, I think. It's not like I wouldn't push the parallel too far, but a parallel between the commanders of the battle school and Rose the Nose. Why does Rose the Nose sleep in with the rest of the army? He doesn't sleep in his commander's quarters. Remember why? Rose the Nose, right? Yeah, because he's afraid of the dark. Because he's afraid of the dark. Because he cries in terror. He swaggers and he tries to set himself up as great and as superior because he's Jewish, right? Which fact he attempts to amplify, right? Both through his emphasizing his Jewishness, right? This makes me a great general. We get the story about the sort of the tradition of Jewish generals, apparently, and even the way that he has that like grossly exaggerated genitalia on his desk, which I'm presuming that the animated penis that Rose the Nose has put on his desk is a circumcised penis. Again, there's like a sense in which he's again amplifying his Jewishness, right? Trying to build up who he is and what he, but he's afraid, right? In the end, we see it's insecurity, terrible insecurity on the part of Rose the Nose, and that he can't even sleep by himself because he's so scared. Major Anderson used to sleep well too, but he doesn't anymore. Why? Because he's afraid of monsters, and so they're going to send, they're going to create their own monster who's even more scary than those other. He's so scary that he's going to make the other monsters afraid, right? So again, you have. They want a monster. It's not that him becoming Peter, him becoming a monster, is sort of an unfortunate side effect, right? That, okay, in order to sharpen him, to become the best soldier possible, like he's going to have to do some monstrous things. He's going to have to be, and that's sort of lamentable, but it's kind of necessary. No, it's the goal. in one sense, that's exactly the goal, to break him down, to separate him, to isolate him, to dehumanize him. That's not only the means to make him into the perfect tool, that's the kind of tool they need, or at least that they believe they need. Yes, and you're right, Sean, even his name, the nickname he's adopted for himself, Rose the Nose, is a reference to his Jewishness as well. You're right. Yeah. Okay, all right. I said I had 3 things left. I now have 2 things left. I'll do one of those 2 things, and I'll save the other one for next time. Graff. Remember at the beginning, back in our first class, Graff was sort of put forward at the beginning of the book as like the representative of humanity. Remember we talked that Graff was like the spokesperson for the collective. Ender was going to be the tool. His job was to become the tool again. Graff totally open about this. And Graff was the spokesperson of humanity, but not just the spokesperson of humanity. He was acting on the part of humanity, right? He was the embodiment of the human collective manipulating, producing. Remember how, humanity produces an individual of genius, right? He was humanity producing. He was the means by which humanity was producing that individual of genius, who was what they needed at that moment. But notice in this section, we're beginning to see a wider and wider breach. Graff is not just humanity. There's a real gap there. We see on the one hand Graff's bitterness. This is Anderson speaking to Graff. Colonel, sir, I admit I was on you. I admit I was a pain in the ass, but it worked. Everything worked, just like you wanted it to. The last few weeks, Ender's even been happy, says Graff. Content. He's doing well. His mind is keen. His play is excellent. Young as he is, we've never had a boy better prepared for command. Usually they go at 11, but at 9.5 he's top flight. Well, yes, for a few minutes there it actually occurred to me to wonder what kind of a man would heal a broken child of some of his hurt, just so he could throw him back into battle again. A little private moral dilemma. Please overlook it. I was tired. Saving the world, remember? Says Anderson. We see Graff aware of his own monstrosity. We see, this is one of several moments where we see Graff expressing remorse. Graff is one of the only other characters, other than Ender, who has these moments. Graff too has the gift of self-loathing here. That is, so Graff is a monster, but wait a second, being a monster means being separated from humanity, like by definition. To be a monster is not to be human, right? Those 2 things are opposite. Graff sees himself, what he's doing to Ender, as monstrous. That is, Graff is not humanity. Graff also is a tool, right? His job as a tool is to create Ender, the tool, right? To sharpen Ender. He is the whetstone that is supposed to sharpen the blade that is Ender, but a whetstone is a tool too, right? So even though we see Graff acting, and of course it's another split, it's another breach between Graff and humanity as a whole. This is him talking to this is him talking to Anderson again. It's the beginning of chapter 11. This is when they're about to institute the ridiculous set of battles for Dragon Army. We told the computer, this is Anderson, that our highest priority was having the subject remain useful after the training program. The subject, right? Well, as long as he's useful, says Graff. Look, Colonel Graff, you're the one who made me prepare this over my protests, if you'll remember. I know, you're right, I shouldn't burden you with my conscience, but my eagerness to sacrifice little children in order to save mankind is wearing thin. The polemark has been to see the hegemon. It seems Russian intelligence is concerned that some of the active citizens on the nets are already figuring out how America ought to use the IF to destroy the Warsaw Pact as soon as the buggers are destroyed. Seems premature. It seems insane. Free speech is one thing, but to jeopardize the League over nationalistic rivalries? And it's for people like that, short-sighted, suicidal people, that we're pushing Ender to the edge of human endurance. I think you underestimate Ender. But I fear that I also underestimate the stupidity of the rest of mankind. Are we absolutely sure that we ought to win this war? Is humanity worth saving? He's asking. Sean asks, is he talking about Demosthenes? Sean, yeah, I mean, we don't have, it doesn't explicitly say, but I have to believe that that's in fact what we see. Either he's talking about Demosthenes or he's talking about people who are, you know, following Demosthenes and responding to Demosthenes. So yes, it is Peter and Valentine. So of course we see that, you know, there's a marvelous dramatic irony in that sentence. It's for people like that we're pushing Ender to the edge of human existence. It's for people like his brother and sister that we're pushing Ender to the edge of human endurance. The terrible irony of that sentence, right? Because of course Ender's doing it for Valentine, right? He's doing it to save. He's never met all of humanity, but he quite liked to save Valentine from being. Remember, he has those images of Valentine's head being blown up like the Marines in the bugger videos, right? And he doesn't want to. He wants to keep the buggers from coming down and killing Valentine, so he's willing to become a tool to sacrifice himself for the higher end and all that, right? So yeah, it's for the sake of those of people like that they're pushing Ender to the edge of human existence, or of human endurance. Yeah. But again, notice, here we have Graff not only being differentiated from humanity, not only being isolated himself, and we see, you know, how much resistance he's getting from Anderson, from General Pace, you know, who comes up, though, was the one who threatens him with a capital court-martial at the end. Graff is isolated from them. He is alone. We see how alone Graff is. Nobody else agrees with Graff, but Graff is right. Graff succeeds. Graff is an effective tool. Why is he an effective tool? Because he's isolated, because he's an individual, because he is a monster. Lee Smith sent me an email earlier in the week, which I also thought was very interesting. She was pointing to the interesting point that Colonel Graff of Colonel Graff's weight change over the course of the book. Lee was making the point that it's kind of an unusual thing. You don't usually see a character getting fat and getting thin again over the course of a book. You know, sometimes have fat characters and you have thin characters, but you know, that kind of dynamic weight loss over the course of a book is a little bit unusual. And with Graff, our attention is really drawn to it. Remember when Ender is in his office, there in the later, I think it's in chapter 12, and he sees Graff is really fat. His belly is spilling over either arm of the chair that he's sitting in, and Ender has him. He's like, I don't remember him being fat at all when we first came up here. That is, Ender is seeing the change in Graff. So again, it's like he has become fattened on the flesh of the small children that he has devoured, right? I do read that, Lee, as I think you were also suggesting in your email, as a kind of a metaphor for his monstrosity. Certainly, his own sort of perception of his monstrosity. Sharon Hoff says Graff also just wins thoroughly. Yes, wins thoroughly at what he does. But again, he asks in the end, is it worth it? Is it worth it? Is humanity worth saving? Are we absolutely sure that we ought to win this war? He says, oh, it's not treason, it's just dark comedy, right? Black comedy. Well, okay. But remember the crowds of people with Peter's face, right? And of course, it's literally Peter that he is talking, that is making him doubt whether mankind is worth saving. And if not Peter, one of Peter's many tools. Anyway, yeah. All right, I should stop. I'm not going to keep you forever like I did last time. Oh yeah, boy, I'm like 20 minutes shorter than last class. I've only kept you like 20 minutes longer than I should have instead of like 45 minutes, so that's fine. Um, the last thing I wanted to talk about, which I'm not going to talk about, but I'll introduce it so we can talk about it next time, because it's going to be, I was going to use it as a transition into next week's material anyway. That is, remember at the beginning, we were looking at the assumptions Ender was making about what defines a good army and how a good army has to be. And Sharon Hoff, you were saying they have to become buggers, right? They have to think in completely uniformly, have perfect discipline, submit absolutely to the authority of their commander, be in perfect unison like he sees the buggers being. I want to come back to that. That's the last point that I wanted to make that I don't have time for. Look at think about that observation, think about his study of the bugger wars in the video room, and think about his tactics in the battle room. Think about his toon leaders, Crazy Tom and Hot Soup, and think about Bean. What do we see? What do we see about Ender and tactics, and how do those things connect with all these other ideas that we're looking at? So okay, so that's where we'll go next time. But I'll let you go now. Our last section of the book. In theory, we're supposed to finish discussing the book next time. It is a hugely long section. I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest we're probably not going to finish that whole thing next time. But I certainly, if you don't have a chance to finish the whole rest of the book for next time, I may end up stopping our discussion at the end of the war. So when the game is finally finished, before the whole aftermath, we may not get a chance to talk about the aftermath stuff, the post-war parts of the book. But I am going to definitely push to get all the way through the game, the final game next time. So we will have more time to talk about it. This is, the next class isn't the last week of this class. We have 2 more sessions after that. The 5th one is the one that was hoping to use primarily as a Q&A session. I do hope that we'll probably end up talking about the very end of the book, and then I hope to take some questions also. And then in the final week, I want to talk about the movie and the adaptation of the story. So we'll talk about it. You still have time. If you haven't seen the film yet, you still have time. So that will be 3 weeks from now, and that will then be our last class on Ender's Game before we move on to whatever else our voters have selected for us for next time. So anyway, thanks everybody for another lively discussion. You guys are making some great points. I'm only sorry that I didn't have a chance to read all of your comments and to respond to all of them, but I'm grateful for all of your active contributions here tonight. So thanks very much, everybody. Good night.